couldn't recite the Holy Quran. How else was religion being used against the prisoners? Because I knew firsthand from being down in Guantanamo as the Muslim chaplain that the Quran was being desecrated when I was there. I witnessed, but what would lead the prisoners to take even more drastic measures, like attempting suicide in protest of how the Holy Quran was being treated? Well, this occurred when prisoners came back from interrogation and said, yes, the interrogators are taking the Holy Quran, throwing it on the floor and stepping on it. They would tell me that the interrogators would even kick the Quran across the floor. This is something that's also confirmed in these military investigations that have been made public, that the Quran was abused in the interrogation room. And this is what led to mass suicide attempts on the part of the prisoners. Now, when these suicide attempts were occurring, it became a problem. Not only for the detention operation, but also for the intelligence operation. That individual was no longer an intelligence asset, because how can you glean information from a dead prisoner? So they wanted to resolve this problem of suicide. They didn't know what to do, so they turned to the Muslim chaplain. They said, "Chaplain, what do we do? How do we solve this problem?" So I can say that as the Muslim chaplain down in Guantanamo, the Quran was being desecrated, because I was someone they turned to help resolve the problem. I was praised for these types of recognition, for these types of contributions, recognized. I received official and military awards while I was down in Guantanamo, as well as letters of recognition from the commanding general, Major General Jeffrey Miller. I received the best officer evaluation report that I had ever received in the 14 years as a United States Army officer, which was dated 2 days before I would be arrested. And how did... Well, I was coming back from Guantanamo on what I thought would be a short 2-week break, knowing I was going to have to return to Guantanamo and finish my last 2 months of that year of duty. But when I landed in Jacksonville Naval Air Station, the first stop where service members come back into the country after serving in Guantanamo, I was stopped by the customs officials who searched my bags. But now this is a search being conducted by an extension of a law enforcement agency, the FBI, without probable cause. Of course, a violation of my Fourth Amendment right to be free from an illegal search and seizure. But that didn't really matter too much to me, because it's not like I had anything. But then it would matter, because these customs officials would say, "We've got some suspicious documents." And then these suspicious documents were immediately handed over to the several federal and military intelligence officers who, by the way, just happened to be standing by. No, of course, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a sting operation. And then these intelligence officers would say that the papers they had seized from me were not only suspicious, but they were classified documents. And then they were able to get arrest warrants, and I was thrown in jail, arrested in secret, put in a single solitary cell, held incommunicado initially, and I never showed up at the airport where my family was waiting, my wife and daughter. I had been arrested in secret, and they didn't know what happened to me. I essentially disappeared from society and from the face of the earth. But then they would learn of what happened to me. About 10 days later, when government leaks to the media reported that I had been charged, I'd been arrested and charged with now heinous crimes of spying, espionage, aiding the enemy, mutiny and sedition, which is like trying to overthrow the government, all of course which are capital crimes. And I was even threatened with the death penalty by the military prosecutor days after my arrest. That's how my family learned of where I was, when my face was all over the news, on the front page of major newspapers, all over the world now with the advent of satellite TV, being reported not only by ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, of course, but also now Al Jazeera and BBC, Australia. It's world news that the Muslim chaplain of Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, is suspected of being a terrorist spy. That was the story of the day, of the week, of the following couple months. One of the most frightening experiences was actually how I was then transported to a super maximum security prison from Jacksonville to Charleston, South Carolina. I was brought to the Consolidated Naval Break, which interestingly enough is the location of the U.S. citizen enemy combatants. Foreign enemy combatants we know are held down in Guantanamo and in these other secret CIA black sites that we've recently read about in the Washington Post. But I was sent to South Carolina, Charleston, where they hold the U.S. citizen enemy combatants. The enemy combatants declared by our U.S. president who hold U.S. citizenship. That's where they sent me. The U.S. Southern Command, which oversees the Guantanamo operation, would say that this was only a coincidence. But I know it wasn't a coincidence because of the manner in which they transported me there. I was shackled at the wrist and at the waist and at the ankles, just like the prisoners in Guantanamo, in what we call in the military, and maybe General Karpinski can confirm this, we call it a three-piece suit. Not a three-piece suit like you buy at the mall made by Armani, a three-piece suit of chains. That's what I was shackled in. And then I was thrown in the back of this truck next to an armed guard, two other armed guards in the front. And on the way down to Charleston, South Carolina, to this super maximum security prison, the guard pulls out of this bag these goggles. They're painted black, opaque, and puts them on my eyes, so now I can't see a thing. He next takes out these heavy industrial ear muffs, the likes that you see a construction worker wearing when he's jackhammering in the middle of the street, and puts them on my ears. So now I can't hear a thing. I can't see and I can't hear a thing. And I'm shackled in 3 places. We call this tactic sensory deprivation. Sensory deprivation. And this is something that I recently read about in the newspaper, in which the American Psychiatric Association includes sensory deprivation in their definition of torture. I was subjected to sensory deprivation. I feared for my life being brought to this super maximum security prison, fearing that I could be violently beaten and kicked, especially after hearing from the prisoners in Guantanamo how many of them were violently kicked and beaten while they were transported to Gitmo. And I write about how one of the prisoners told me that if I looked in his medical records, I would see that the Army medics had treated him upon his arrival to Gitmo from being kicked violently in that transport. I feared that this could happen to me. I feared that I could have been shot by that armed guard, and then it would be said of me that I was trying to flee. But nevertheless, when they put me in that cell, that single solitary cell, I was at least relieved that I was still alive. The most ironic part of the situation is that the point is I was denied my religious rights, constitutional religious rights, as a U.S. citizen held in custody. After 76 days in isolation, I was released suddenly from prison. I was never charged with these heinous capital crimes of spying, espionage, or aiding the enemy took place. And then after months of investigation, suddenly all of the charges against me were simply dropped. They disappeared. The case was closed. I was sent back to Fort Lewis, reinstated as a Muslim chaplain, my record wiped clear. I then tendered my resignation from the U.S. military, receiving in January 2005 an honorable discharge. And upon separation, I would receive another Army Commendation Medal for exceptional meritorious service. But I didn't receive an apology, and that's something I strive for today. The lesson of my story, of my experience, is that yes, certainly today, the current approach to fighting this so-called war on terrorism from within our own borders is certainly, without a doubt, a threat to the civil liberties of everyday, ordinary Americans, like myself, like yourselves, and like many others. I wrote about my experience and I speak about it so that hopefully it will inspire others to struggle for fundamental American principles that I strive for today: diversity, tolerance, religious